Yeah.
I see what you're saying. So the Constitution is in many respects the restraining the state as a manifestation of the will of the people.
That's what it was designed to do. That's what our government was designed to do, was to prevent the tyranny of the majority. James Madison was very explicit about that. And I think it works. I think it does exactly what it was intended to do.
Right. I mean, there's no doubt the Constitution was set up to protect property owners, right?
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, without a doubt. I know.
Well, Matt makes a good point in that, democratizing the state and making sure that it's a more direct democracy is probably needed first before any of those dominoes can fall. Would you agree, Carl?
I don't know what the order of operations is, honestly. I'm pretty agnostic about that. But when I think about socialism, a question that I ask is your end game here absolute democratic control of the state or not, or of property or not? And there are a lot of, progressives who would say no, absolutely not. Elizabeth Warren, for example, she would say no. I'm a capitalist to my bones. I do not think that people should have this sort of unlimited control over what property is doing. There should be this institution of private property that is protected.
All right, fair enough. I mean, I still am not sure how I would answer that question. I mean, I think I see the Constitution as an extension of the state. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I would overthrow the entire Constitution, but there are definitely provisions I have a problem with, without a doubt. All right, well, let's go to number 3. Do you support the abolition of private property as opposed to personal property? Will you just walk us through the distinction between private property and personal property?
So, yeah, I think that the best way to understand it is it's a provisional distinction. And what that means is that, the state government in very, socialist countries, it's not like you have government bureaucrats controlling everybody's toothbrush. Or, in Norway, every single tiny little thing that goes on in its energy sector, you have kind of this broad, high level management of what's going on. But then you have a lot of autonomy with what's going on with property. The government, people don't feel this need to control it. So when I talk about private property, what I say is, you should not have this absolute right, say, to control a plot of land. And if the entire rest of the world or the rest of the country says we need this land for such and such a reason, you don't have this private control over it. But you do have this sort of provisional control over it. The rest of the country isn't constantly telling you what to do with it. So it's not like this sort of what people imagine this communist dystopia is, where a government agent is coming and telling you when you can use the bathroom or when you can brush your teeth or all of this stuff. There is a provisional control of property, but then there's sort of a legal and authoritative de facto control of property that is going on by the people through the state, if that makes sense.
So it does, I guess. Like, I guess. So it is that ultimately I guess I'm not sure I fully understand it. So it's,
okay.
So I mean, like, we have eminent domain in this country, right? The state can, the state can take your property. I mean, Kelo said that the state could take the property if they want tax revenue in this instance, or they think giving it to a different private entity will raise tax revenue. Is that the dynamic that you're saying? That like I'm not sure what the distinction of private property and personal property is there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, eminent domain is a kind of useful comparison the way that we talk about it, because while eminent domain does give sort of routes for the government to step in and under certain circumstances, if you're building a train and you need to cross property, or if you're building sewers or something like that, the government can do it. But the government can't just do it for any old reason, you know. If the Democratic majority just decided, this field is beautiful, we want to preserve it, we don't want it ever to be developed. Well, they don't necessarily always have the ability to do that. And we've seen that happen actually in a lot of cases. So what I would talk about in this case is private property should be understood as a sort of set of institutions and norms and laws that prevent the public from even possibly exercising control over property. Now, that doesn't mean that they do all the time, right? They aren't taking your toothbrush, but they have no opportunity in a lot of cases in this country. And in most countries, I would say it's all a matter of degree, right? So people are never exercising absolute control.
And I guess I always understood it as being like essentially private property was really just sort of like any type of property that is used to derive profits, right? Like that maybe like any type of like means of production. And personal property was the stuff that you actually use at any given point. Do I have that wrong?
Well, there are different ways of thinking about it, and I think it sort of depends on what aspect of the economy you're analyzing. But, like Marx writes, freedom can only consist in this, that socialized man govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under their collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power. And he uses that kind of phrasing a lot. And what he's talking about is there's this problem under capitalism where the community cannot exercise rational control over the economy, over property, over what's going on. There are these weird limits that we've set in place to what they are and are not able to do. And so a big part of the abolition of private property is just tearing down these arbitrary limits that prevent people from doing that. And so if you do that, then you do end up throwing a wrench in the ability of capitalists to exploit your labor and things like that. But just the abolition of private property here is the first step.
So you're really abolishing the concept of any property that you own being protected from the state or as a manifestation of the will of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And and that can apply to anything, like my coffee mug, if I wanted it to, or the podcast, or the guy who owns this building.
I think it can. And that idea is obviously scary to people who imagine the government doing all kinds of horrible things with property that they want to think of as theirs and that they want to control. But I think that is sort of the battlefield of politics, right? That is where where our task as people as socialists is to prevent the government from exercising this kind of tyrannical control and trying to make it function in rational ways rather than irrational ways. That's why Marx says it talks about rational control.
How does that and there's no limiting principle, but how does it, right? I mean, that's the point.
Yeah.
There's no limiting principle. Yeah. How does that what's the check on that, though? I mean, I get it that we need to be rational, but there's no institutional check on that, or there's no tension. It's really just a function of our own rationality in that society.
I mean, even we shouldn't fool ourselves. Even when we build these institutional checks, we are sort of trying to exercise our rationality and saying, okay, this is a check that makes sense. This is a constraint on the government that makes sense. A problem with that comes up is a lot of times it's too rigid, and it becomes the set rule, and suddenly in cases it becomes irrational. So I think that the check on what the government can and cannot do is, in the end, always, it always has to do with the will of the people and what they are willing and not willing to push back against collectively. And I think that getting rid of private property demystifies that and makes the struggle over power, these struggles over property, very clear. And I think that's a good thing. It really exposes us to the sort of brute reality of what a lot of political struggle is. But I think that also gives us an opportunity to see it clearly and to manage it in a more rational way.
All right, that makes sense. Number 4, do you think that a capitalist economy ultimately can be reformed in a way that is reasonably non-exploitive of workers? What does reasonably mean here? That was one of my big questions.
Yeah. So, when you're engaged in any kind of collective endeavor, you are going to have situations where, say, somebody is working a little harder than usual, maybe. Sometimes you might have a global pandemic, and suddenly nurses are required to work extremely long hours. And I think, this is not ideal for them. It's not something they want to do, but I think everybody sort of understands this is just something that has to happen in a rational, functional society. So there are situations where workers are not always just doing exactly what they want and living in a utopia. In a sort of sane society, that's not happening. But I think that when you abolish private property and when they're controlling the means of production because of that, because it's collectively controlled, that exploitation is being minimized as much as possible in that sense, as much as they're able to minimize it.
So in other words, if it's a car factory, workers are going to have far more participation in the value of the output of that car factory. But there may be times where, like, we had a production run or we had a problem and we need, I'm just trying to sort of get into, that concept more as to like what reasonably constitutes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think again,
give me an example of unreasonable.
Unreasonable. I mean, an example of unreasonable is when you are manufacturing a commodity that society doesn't need just for somebody to get richer and wealthier, and really having more money than they need. And there are an infinite number of examples of that happening in our world. But, socialism has to be able to accommodate situations like pandemics where nurses have to work hard, wartime economies, disasters, situations where it's less than ideal for workers. And that's why this is collectively managed by the state, by everybody, or everybody is managing it through the state, rather. And
I think my answer to this would have been like, I tend to doubt it, but probably